welcome to the Institute for Government for the first event in our new series on infrastructure. One of the absolutely key issues, public policy issues in the UK for the infrastructure itself, but actually a little bit of our macroeconomic strategy is also linked into this at the moment. We're delighted to be doing this series and indeed a wider project in association with the Project Management Institute. And before we go any further, I just wanted to ask Craig Killow from the Project Management Institute to say a few words about the partnership.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And I'd like to also express our excitement and anticipation around this project and the collaboration that we will have with the Institute for Government. A little background on PMI. We're going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. And as you all know, the recognition of project management as a profession hasn't been going on very long, but we do know that projects have been in existence since the beginning of time. The Project Management Institute is the largest professional membership organization in the world around the profession of project management. We have over 2 million stakeholders in virtually every country of the world. Our specialty is in research, the development of thought leadership, advocacy for the profession, and globally recognized standards and certifications. We take great pride in the ability to do what we call connecting the dots. We have programs globally, as I mentioned, but we like to be able to identify notable practice, areas of excellence, and bring those concepts, philosophies, and methods to the rest of the world for consideration. We're particularly excited about this project in that it concentrates on one of the primary areas of focus that we have been emphasizing for the past few years, particularly in the finance area. The concept around the long-term investment and infrastructure development is a subject that virtually every country in the world is dealing with. We are very proud to say we're collaborating with the World Economic Forum in their new initiative around this subject, and also have communications with a number of countries and mega treaty organizations around the world. We're also proud to bring to you tonight Dr. Ed Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman is previously the Chief Knowledge Officer for the United States National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Had a very distinguished career in NASA, and now he brings his capabilities to PMI in helping us represent the profession. So I'll turn it back over to our staff now, and for a look forward to a great evening. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much. Yes, it's good there. It's good there. Great. So next stage on the order is to sort of take us through the starting sort of proposition for this is success in infrastructure. Are bigger projects better? And what we really want to get into tonight is that sort of, the mega projects that we talk a lot about, the HS2s, all of those things that hit the headlines, and actually a body of literature that a lot of people here will know fairly well that says actually look smaller, incremental changes and improvements. That's where the real value lies. What happens in our public policy decision making? What happens about the delivery and the risks we face from the different choices we make about how we approach infrastructure? And we have an excellent panel this evening just to talk about and kick off the discussion on that, and then I hope we'll get a lot of comments and thoughts from around the room as well. I know there's a lot of people with some really vast experience in the room tonight. first panellist is Bridget Rosewell, who many people will know very well, on the National Infrastructure Commission for the UK, but of course has done huge amounts of other things with Volterra Partners in particular, but also I think you're chair of the audit at National Rail or Network Rail at the moment.
I'm on the board of Network Rail.
Okay,
yes.
a fun job anyway, whichever way it
goes.
Definitely. And also as being, long-term advisor to the Greater London Authority, among many other things. Second, I've got Isabel Dedring with us, who is, I think now at the moment, the global transport leader at Arup at the minute, but of course previously has been Deputy Mayor for Transport, responsible for a huge range of things from our cycle infrastructure in London through to getting rid of tube delays, as it were. And also I think you were the Mayor's Environment Advisor before that, and also worked various things, including McKinsey, during your career. So really great to have you with us tonight. And Craig's already mentioned Ed Hoffman. I think currently the CEO of Knowledge Engagement, I think, but previously 33 years at NASA, including founding the NASA Academy of Program and Project Management and Engineering Leadership. So a vast experience of some incredibly high-profile projects over the years. The format for this evening is we'll take initial thoughts from our three panellists. Then I'll probably ask a few questions, just probing and seeing how the different things add up. But then we'll throw it open to questions, comments, discussion from the floor. As ever, this is a public event, so all comments are on the record. Please do tweet if you wish to. The hashtag, which I think is IFG infrastructure, is behind me. Please stick it on that. Yes, please engage in the discussion. I think I'll start with Bridget if you want to kick us off. Thanks.
Right, thanks very much. And it's great to be here. Slightly nervous about PERDA rules, but nonetheless, I will do my best to be open. And the challenge here is bigger better? To which the short answer is better at what? And unless you've decided what your project is supposed to be for and supposed to do, then it seems to me it's incredibly difficult to say whether bigger or smaller is better. I think that one of the reasons that the many pieces of analysis have shown that smaller incremental is better is because of the criteria that have been used to identify the benefits and scope the projects. I'm an economist by background, and anybody else in the room who's been trained in economics will recognise the term ceteris paribus, other things being equal. The smaller the project, the easier it is to hold other things equal. So if I'm talking for, a roundabout to be put into a road to give access to a new development, it's quite easy to hold quite a lot of things equal, stable, while you look at what effect that roundabout is going to have on access for the properties and indeed on any other disruption that it might cause for the people who've previously been able to drive along that road undisturbed by the roundabout. So you can hold a lot of things constant while you look at that. But as we go up the scale of project, the time frame over which it's likely to happen and the impacts that it's likely to have get bigger and bigger until we get to something like High Speed 2, where you can pretty well hold nothing constant. Nothing is held equal while you think about what the impact of this project is likely to be, and therefore the reasons that you're doing it are also likely to be very different from the reasons that you want to put in, or you're asking the developer to put in a roundabout so that you can get access to for these new houses. So unless you've understood what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then you set that appraisal relevant to that achievement, you're likely to come unstuck. Most of the analysis on welfare benefits for transport projects, which particularly where the Eddington report came to the conclusion incremental is better, is because it was easier to capture those benefits. When we started looking at Crossrail, which is dear to both Isabel and my hearts, we quickly discovered that actually that really wasn't why you were doing it. The purpose of this project was to bring more people into central London so they could take better paid jobs than they would otherwise be able to take. So that is the criterion against which you need to appraise it, and that is the criterion against which you should in the future judge it. We haven't got to that part yet because it's not yet open, but that, what difference would this make to the ability to get better paid jobs in central London? Was that additional, was it not additional? We had lots of debate. I can see some of the people with whom that debate was engaged in the room today. But that at the end of the day was the crucial question. If we go to HS2, that wasn't about delivering more people into central London, although some of the arguments we developed for that got used. It's more about what is the benefit to the UK economy of making cities closer together. I'm not sure we've actually solved that analytical problem as yet. It's certainly a very difficult problem, but just the fact that it's difficult doesn't make it the wrong question, and falling back on, if you like, answering the wrong question because you can answer the wrong question easily and answering the right question is hard is not actually a good method of making decisions. In the National Infrastructure Commission, we have been charged with looking forward 30 years and gauging the infrastructure needs of the economy and how those should be brought together for the next 30 years. What's going to happen in 30 years' time? I don't have a clue, and neither anybody who tells you that they do is wrong. We can have views, we can have inklings, we can say some things are possible, but we cannot know, and therefore answering the question what infrastructure we're going to need and what things we should be thinking about doing to make possible the infrastructure requirements or meet those infrastructure needs over the next 30 years is essentially looking in a much more probabilistic way at those needs rather than saying here's a need, this is the provision that we need to meet it. One of the things that I've said on many occasions, and I'm going to keep saying it, is that I think that means that what we need to think about is the possible states of the world that we might imagine, and those infrastructure investments which will be worthwhile in all the states of the world that we can imagine. The infrastructure projects that would be worthwhile in most of the states of the world that we can manage, if you like, the central, the most likely one standard deviation states of the world that we can imagine. And those projects which are a bet, those projects which will pay off big time in some states of the world, but you might risk wasting your money. Getting government to get hold of the proposition that it might be worth risking wasting money, I have to say, is extremely hard. And that is the challenge I will leave all of you with. How do we make that case to, on all our behalves, to the people who are going to have to make that decision? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Bridget. Do you want to go, Isabel, with your thoughts
definitely.
on this?
So I think my role here is to provide a kind of political perspective on it, although my role was in politics, in a political environment, but I'm more of a civil servant by nature and by training. I'm a lawyer by training and prefer to take an analytical approach to things. And when you first come into politics, it seems the exact opposite of an analytical approach, although it has its own rules and principles that are derivable, actually. And I think that's not often well understood by a lot of people in the infrastructure industry who want, the pie chart says this, so we should go off and do it. But politics is both a science and an art, and actually you can derive certain principles there. So answering the question of bigger being better, from a political perspective, bigger is better, but it's because it's more deliverable, I think. Bigger projects, in my experience, are sometimes easier to get to happen than smaller projects. But it's not for the reason that people often think about ribbon cutting. You had a question when the materials you sent us about, politicians love to cut ribbons, right? That's why they like big projects. The one thing you know about announcing a big project, if you're a politician, is that somebody else will cut the ribbon on that, not you. So you are just handing something on a plate to the next guy. So politicians explicitly don't care about that as something to, in my experience, to do. There's lots of things that you can get lots of great headlines for in terms of, the tube delay work we did was a big issue in London at the time that we tackled it, and it made the mayor look good that he gripped that. So yes, politicians care about headlines and announcements, but there's lots of ways to do that without cutting a ribbon on a piece of infrastructure. So I think that's a major sort of piece of mythology within the infrastructure industry that just needs to be, kind of like put to one side and removed. And then conversely, small stuff, or a related point is that small stuff can be much more politically difficult than larger projects. And the reason is that people can mobilize and understand smaller projects much more easily than they can mobilize behind Crossrail. Hundreds of communities are affected by Crossrail. Only 1 or 2 communities are affected by changing the roundabout at Elephant and Castle. And so the noise that can be generated by small projects politically can be many times greater than the noise generated by large projects, and politicians will understandably respond to that. The last thing I was going to say was relating to Craig's point around finance. And we all recognize that the infrastructure pipeline globally isn't as big as it should be. It's many orders of magnitude smaller than it should be because of this sort of wall of projects, wall of money. We can't figure out how to meet it. And at City Hall, I'm sure Bridget gets this all the time too. People go, oh, it's really easy. The Canadian pension funds have billions of pounds. Just go and talk to them. Steve's smiling at the back. Steve Allen, who used to be the FD at TfL when I was at City Hall. And people would, and you know, I've got the answer to all your problems. Just call the Canadians. And it just isn't that simple, right? Anyone who's tried to do this knows. And the example I was going to just give you quickly was, obviously in London, you know, London's growing, or, you know, we thought it was until Brexit happened, and you know, so it's still at the moment. So when I was at City Hall, the plan was to, you know, support London's growth going forward, and the big issue in London obviously is housing, where housing isn't growing at the rate that it needs to. And so the London plan and the Mayor's transport strategy identify a number of growth areas, because London's low density. Saying to people we're going to, you know, densify the whole city is politically not, you know, going to work. But if you focus growth in particular areas and regeneration in particular areas, and then you focus the transport there to support the densification of those areas. So the London plan identifies 30 places where we're going to focus growth, and you need transport in almost all of those locations to unlock that growth. And 30 locations feels doable, right? We need 30, you know, major transport interventions across the city, some huge, some, you know, medium-sized. And the reason that we can't deliver 30 at the same time as a collection of institutions, City Hall, Transport for London, the private sector, is, you know, in my view, 2 things. One is that each of these projects require a very significant amount of senior time. So the Northern Line extension, which several of us were quite involved in, is a £1 billion project. Sounds big, but in transport world, £1 billion is like nothing. And to get that project to happen required many, many hours of negotiation between the borough leaders, between, you know, my colleague Eddie Lister at City Hall, who's the deputy mayor for planning, the mayor, the guys running the developers. So these are very senior people, the commissioner of Transport for London, coming together over and over again to negotiate that deal. So imagine doing that 10 times over, 20 times over in the city. It's not feasible at one point in time. That's sort of problem one. Then, and like in business, you know, if senior people aren't paying attention to something to get it to happen, it's probably not going to happen. But secondly, the engine room to get those deals to happen, the people who can create projects, negotiate commercial terms, who understand financial risk and how it can be allocated, and negotiating those deals. That skill set in the infrastructure industry is extremely thin on the ground, not to say almost non-existent. And you know, as several people here will know, within TfL we had probably fewer than 5 people who could negotiate and manage those sorts of deals in an organization that has a £10 billion turnover budget. So, and we're, you know, we were doing great compared to a lot of other organizations in the infrastructure industry who don't even have one person who has that skill set. So I think a really significant question for government in this country, but also elsewhere, is how do we create that cohort of people that are able to either create projects, they could be in the private sector. Increasingly, cities are looking at unsolicited bid type of approaches. They need to be within the public sector. Is that a role for the IPA? Is it a role for Treasury? Is it a role for NIC? You know, it doesn't really matter, but those people don't exist anywhere, and we need to start to create them. Otherwise, those 2 walls of projects and money are never going to meet.
Excellent, thank you for that. Lots of really meaty thoughts there. I'll bring in Ed now, just with your sort of comments, but I may come back to some of those particular people issues come up again and again in all our work here at the Institute. Ed, do you want to take us through your sort of thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things you're saying is, what is a guy from NASA doing? Talking about infrastructure, but biggest flagship mission, International Space Station. You know, it's basically a large home in space. So it's building, it's construction, it's transportation, it's all these factors, but you're doing it in space. You know, the questions, looking at the questions, success, you know, projects, bigger, what's better? And this would come up at NASA because NASA would typically at any time have a few hundred projects. Most of them are going to be, by our definition, small. A small project would typically be $200 million or less. The big ones would be called flagships. A big project is a flagship. When someone says, what is a flagship, it means you cannot fail. You cannot, it means NASA, the country, the world. The International Space Station is about 23 different countries. You know? European Space Agency, you cannot fail your country. And so it raises different things. One of our best managers was a guy who used to teach in a lot of our courses, Jerry Madden. He spent most of his career on small projects. And then towards the end, he was working the Hubble Space Telescope, a NASA flagship, bigger. I said, Jerry, what's better? And he says, I love the small ones. He said, if I'm doing the small ones, I don't have to worry about headquarters. I don't have to worry about the executives in DC. Don't have to worry as much about politics. But, size doesn't matter because you're running a project. Anybody who's working at NASA, the entire budget, 18 to 19 billion a year, goes through projects. And these people live for their projects. So success, has to do with how professional, the capability in terms of what's taking place. Advantages of large is that you can't fail. Now you can be fired and replaced, because the old joke at NASA is if you want to be a successful project manager, be the second one. In the really big ones that go over 20, 30 years, be the third one, right? Because what happens is you're not going to fail, but benefits, realization, real key thing. If you're part of the big mission at NASA, you basically, by definition, you are in the strategy statement of your organization. Second thing we know about, project success, PMI research, executive sponsorship. The things I was doing as the chief knowledge officer, as the director of the NASA Academy, I couldn't fail. I could be replaced. Because at the end of the day, it was part of the NASA strategy that had to be successful. You have the connections to the executive leadership. Number 3 is you can, not a good thing, but you can eat the lunch of small projects. Because if you're running out of budget, you can't fail. So you're going to get money from other people. Now, if you do that, again, they're going to replace you. You're not going to make friends, and you're going to move into a different direction. So you have flexibility, you have the ability to be agile, you can adapt, you'll have the resources. The trade-off is that you better be really good at stakeholder management, because you're not going to have a balanced life. You're basically working a key thing. You're going to be presenting. You're going to have a lot more project reviews of something smaller. You're going to get calls. I had some leaders who were, they were calling me saying, I can't deal. What can't you deal with? The NASA administrator is calling me every afternoon at 5:30. And so it sounds cool for about the first 3 days, but, I like to travel in terms of the work I did at NASA. We had a failure that happened to me on travel in Australia. NASA administrator was not happy when he heard that his chief knowledge officer is someplace else. And so it was, these things change. So the visibility changed the dynamic. There are folks who love working smaller missions, technology-based, advanced technology tryouts, research things, and they will tell you there's a little bit less visibility. Okay? Now again, I say size doesn't matter, because when I retired from NASA, it was August 20th, after 33 great years. August 21st, I started working as a strategic advisor to the Project Management Institute. My wife says I'm crazy because I love projects. I do. I've heard people say project management isn't a attractive or sexy field. I think it's what's the best thing around. And my favorite of all the stuff that PMI has, my favorite thing is the talent triangle, because to me that's about success, and success is leadership. It's about strategy. It's about business management smarts, and it's about the technical discipline capability. That one chart says that. And whether you're small, big, or medium, at the end of the day, you have the calling, and that's going to drive it. So you'll have a little bit more flexibility, a lot more flexibility in your life. But at the end of the day, every program or project that NASA is being funded people are tracking it, watching it, and it's vital. So it's the professionalism, and that gets into the benefits, the executive sponsorship, developing talent, and being a professional project practitioner at the end of the day. So I think it's all those things. But what do you like?
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Ed. Just before I come to question comments from the audience, just a few things that sort of came out, struck me in a lot of that. The first thing is this, the senior time and actually the prioritization. I mean, it's a theme that we've been coming back to again and again at the Institute. Governments are typically overcommitted. And at the moment, we're beyond even what we normally overcommit to with the amount of things facing the UK. When you were dealing, Isabel, in that political world, how do you help people to prioritise? Where's the big decisions that you're going to actually have to focus on for the next few years? Does that come naturally? What do you do when actually you think the organisation it's trying to do too much? How do people cope with that sort of thing in your experience?
Well, what I tried to do is to kind of prioritize based not only on politics, right, which is probably the wrong answer, and not only on analysis, which probably isn't going to get you anywhere because it's got to be connected to something that's politically relevant. So you've got to find that, that's sort of obvious, but you've got to find that middle ground. And often you get people who are running projects who are like, this is the most important thing and I'm right. And, you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the politician, figure out what's important to them, and then obviously just, recast your projects into whatever matters. So when I worked at TfL under Ken's administration, I did a lot of work on carbon because that was very important for Ken. When Boris came in, air quality came up the agenda. We just redefined all this is an air quality program, obviously. So hybrid buses, electric buses, this is all about air quality. Nothing, forget carbon, that was like the last guy. And you just have to be a little bit craven in politics and kind of go with the flow. And I think that is important actually because people in the industry I find is, now working with a lot of engineers and in my old job as well, we've got to do the thing that's the right thing. Well, you've got to marry that up with realpolitik. I was just thinking, because we were talking earlier about, we've worked on a couple of projects together in various guises that are big projects. And I think big projects tend to attract a disproportionate amount of senior attention and disproportionate political attention. But actually the economic case is often much poorer than it should be because economics and sort of case making in government can't really deal with transformational step change. Whereas small projects are the exact opposite. They probably have disproportionately good business cases and get disproportionately less attention. So there's an interesting question about how you can rebalance that. We need to improve the case making for the large projects and the transformational step change analysis. But at the same time, we need to improve the attention on the smaller projects, which aren't that small. In transport, small is 200, 500 million pounds.
Yeah. And I was going to say, actually, Bridget, do you want to come in on that? But I had a follow-up question for you.
One of the difficulties, though, in prioritisation is nobody ever stops anything.
Yeah.
So what happens is, everything just, that cut and that everything just gets pushed a little bit to the right, and because if you stopped it, you would have to then say you'd wasted the money that you'd spent so far on doing it, and how are you actually going to deal with that? So what happens is you get this kind of murky set of stuff which is on the back burner. Sometimes keeping it on the back burner, we kept Crossrail going actually for years on the back burner with more engineering being done. Was that wasted money or not? Actually, I keep trying to work out how one would know whether that time spent to keep the project going, doing more value engineering, doing a little bit of this, doing a little bit of that was actually the right thing to do, or whether some of that was wasted, don't know. So there's a sense in which the big projects don't just get the senior time, they get that continuing rolling time, while the other things sort of sit there in this murky black hole at the back, and then later on they may be dragged out. But sometimes you actually just need to say, no, we're not going to do that. And then you can clear the air, and the people who've still got that as their favourite project can actually move on and do something else. And that, I think, is quite important.
Murkily managing 50 murky projects rather than just pick the 4. Those are the things you're going to do, and just put all your time and effort into it. Yeah. Otherwise, you just don't deliver anything.
Exactly, and that is a risk, and it happens, I think, in a lot of government departments that it just sort of, we'll just move it back a bit.
Yeah. What smart projects will do. So again, it comes down to relationship management, right? Stakeholders, politics. You can call it what you want, but what smart project leaders working a small project will do is that they will demonstrate tremendous value to a flagship mission, to the point where you're doing so many good things to help this key mission that you kind of protect yourself. The kind of a project that's always threatened, and when money runs out, things get canceled, is, first of all, if you're running over budget, you're 30% or over, you're not part of one of the key missions that NASA has. You don't have an international collaboration. A lot of folks on NASA, they love international projects. 80% of our work is international because, frankly, once you have an international agreement, and now people will disagree with me, but it's not true. Once you have an international agreement as a project person, you love it because you may not be a flagship, but it's hard to kill. It's harder to kill. So again, if I don't have an international agreement, if I don't have industry stakeholders who really love what I'm doing, if I'm running over, I tell people you're a ghost. You better start looking for something else because you will get constraints and those things will go away.
Yeah, we have one very big power station coming up in the UK, which has a lot of international agreements behind it. But anyway, see how that one ends up.
That is probably part of the reason it didn't stop.
Yeah, Bridget, just before we go on, I just wanted to come back to this people and talent point. You were talking about different ways of making decisions, and you know, government's got to use different methodologies if it's doing the transformational pieces. And Isabel was picking up on the weakness sometimes of the business cases. How do we get people into government? Or is it Whitehall departments, or is it through the commission, or is there some way of building up the people who can actually do that analysis, who can, you know, really say, you know, this is the type of stuff we should be doing, and then we can play that into the political and all the decision making, all the linking up that you've got to do around that. Is there a way of doing that?
Well, it's a slow burn, I think, and I also would agree that it's particularly sort of project scope, project appraisal skills, which are, I agree with you, that's, you know, wish I'd done that. It is incredibly important, and it's very undervalued out there in the world, if you like, as to how best you make sure that you've got a good deliverable project which is understood by these people who know how they can deliver it, and is understood and agreed by these people who are the sponsors, and making sure that you've got the right interface between project scope, people who've decided why they want it, what it is they are buying, and the people who are going to deliver it. So it's not an answer to the question, because I don't think we keep talking about it being like that, but we don't actually manage to do it very well. It keeps on it gets murky, and it gets murky as soon as something isn't quite going immediately to plan, and on the whole, the bigger the project, some part of it will go wrong, almost certainly. And therefore, how you manage those interfaces in that part when it goes wrong, I think is a great difficulty. And I think that the challenge, therefore, is to build the skill set which enables that risk management to be done appropriately in the project and explained appropriately to the sponsors, so that the political risks, can then be managed. So to my mind, it's training in risk management and risk identification for everybody, including me. You know, there's always more that you could learn about that risk management piece and how you think about risk management. And if we all went off and had a seminar on that, that would be a good start.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And that actually leads on nicely too. So I was going to come back to Ed on. You mentioned, and you gave me actually some wonderful examples of the stakeholder management stroke small p politics that are involved in leading any kind of project in, you know, an organisation. I was wondering, how did NASA go about developing people who had not just the technical ability, they actually could deliver the project, but actually understood and were happy and comfortable with the politics that go around that start to touch into some of the areas that we've been talking about, the linkage of. How did NASA get a cadre of people like that into its organisation?
Yeah. So actually, I'll follow up with the risk, because risk is a key driver for a project. Now, NASA, engineering organization, science, they love technical risks. Engineers love, the bigger problem technically, they love, give it something no one's ever done, no one can do, you're the only one, they will sign up, they'll knock down the door. Second risk is economic, cost, fiscal. We don't really love that. Now they value it because if you don't have the money, you're not going anyplace, so they'll learn to do that well. But I would say that there's a third risk, which is social risk, and I will include political as part of that. And if you look at the history of failures of projects, and you can look at your own organization, but I can always say this at NASA, when we had problems, when we failed, it was typically the social risk. And the social risk is, how do we work with our team? And that's not easy because by definition, team, 90% of a NASA mission is industry. Think of many supply chain, 80% international, partnership. And although NASA is an engineering project, everything is for science. And that means everything is 100% universities. So a real key question is how effectively do you work in that team? And that's the social risk. And by definition, we typically don't like, I've had many project managers say, I really love project management, I love all that. The only thing I hate is dealing with people. Well, this is a problem. You got a lot of people love robotics, but it comes down to the people. So we got to start talking about risk from the standpoint of the people, the social, the team, the participation, and how you do that. And when you get that, then you start focusing on it.
And that's why you have to get everybody in the room so that people
Yep.
understand the different perspective. The different people have a very different thing in their head when they say the word risk.
Yes.
They think about it differently.
Right.
So it's that mutual understanding which is crucial.
But I think the other thing is that, engineers and generally technical people, they, it's sort of like, I've done all my work. The longer the pack is, the better, the better that I give to the mayor to explain how incredibly complicated this is and how clever I am. And I'm going to give you this 200-page thing. Could you digest that into a 20-second soundbite on the BBC News this evening?
Yep.
Poor politicians got to read that whole thing and turn it into something that a 5-year-old could understand. But it's our job as technicians to do that. But similarly, I think the more we can translate the social, to use your language, into something that would be engineering friendly, which is sort of like a formula or a set of things or a set of criteria. I do a lot of talks with our staff about giving examples about, it is sort of a checklist. There's a set of things that you do. You don't go to a community with a finished product and say, I designed this thing, it's really amazing. Here, I'd like to know what you think, but by the way, I've already done it. You go with a blank piece of paper and you say, I know you have some problems in the community, tell me what they are, what would you like to see, blah, blah, blah. Of course you know the answer, but then you come back with the answer and they go, that's exactly what we wanted. Great, fine. That was simple. Anyone can understand that, but I think it's just helping people to understand it in a kind of almost analytical way, which isn't about the weird unpredictability of the strange creatures called humans, but is about, actually turning that into a bit of a tick list or a formula or something like that.
Well, to me also, a definition of a project and program, and again, my background is psychology, so I probably see everything from humans and people. But to me, the definition of a project age is you have hundreds of people from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
You're going to have lawyers, you're going to have acquisition people, you're going to have different engineers who have to work together. So there's an expert problem. And I learned this repeatedly after NASA leaders would come down and say, these people are smart, how come they do such dumb things? And the reality is that we tend to have been raised, I was raised to think of demonstrating my capability in my field. And if I got it right, it's up to the rest of you to get your stuff right.
Right.
And the solution is at that collective level. And so again, how you define that collectivity, that team, do you communicate honestly with the international partner? Do you communicate with Washington and headquarters? And the more you say no to those things, the more you adding the threats to the
And
project.
yet some of the most exciting things you can do is when you get those collaborations right. When you get, you've got the lawyers and the economists and the engineers and the environmentalists and everybody is in a room thinking, how do we solve this problem?
Yes.
And bringing all their different expertise.
I'm going to go to the audience in a moment, but I'm going to come back to Isabel
Sorry,
first.
you keep talking
and let
forever.
that go, yes.
And the problem is that we need, because we've internally within Arup, I can see the same problem. And you want somebody who's an integrator, right? Who can draw on all those technical people and bring them together. But calling them a program manager is like #1 top tip way to never get anybody interested in that job, except for you, obviously. So fantastic. Generally, right, we need to just rebrand it and call it something totally different that sounds amazing.
Okay, so that's the other challenge to the audience is to come up with the exciting buzzy name for the jobs that we know that we need to get.
I was going to pick up on Isabel sort of taking these deep and complex sort of things and putting them into pithy, short questions and comments. Who wants to have the first go from the audience at doing that? Tony, we'll start with you.
Tony Travers from the London School of Economics. Wouldn't the title imply... Yes, I love that, thank you. The title sort of implies some missing words, really, doesn't it? Because it's success in infrastructure. Are bigger publicly funded or publicly guaranteed projects better? That's by implication what we're talking about. I doubt in the private sector there are conferences about bigger infrastructure projects being better. They'll be looking for productivity, improving profits, whatever. Having said that, there are inevitably some projects that can only be delivered in the public sector, and they're often very large. So we're all on the same page at that point. However, the kind of coalitions that build up for these projects, which are necessary, are often hard to differentiate from those which have self-interest in the project being developed. So the huge numbers of consultants and academics and think tanks and all the people we all spend our lives with often are making a general case and a good case for a big project which will help the country or help an area of the country. But sometimes it's hard to differentiate between that and their collective self-interest in getting money out of government. And in that fault line lies a great opportunity for people to oppose projects which might be a good idea. And so it's trying to find a way of working out more than using, we've got to do more analysis and more benefit cost ratio and all of this sort of stuff. Trying to find a way of coming up with a convincing way of ensuring projects don't look like, to put it brutally, rent-seeking behaviour.
Excellent, thanks, Tony. I'll take a few more questions before I come back to the panel. I think the gentleman there, yes.
Simon Webb from Nichols Group. We're programme partners on Crossrail and interested in moving forward these projects. Can I just follow up what this comment here by saying, don't let's assume that this all has to be public sector driven. I think property companies are nowadays often very interested in integrating the bigger schemes they're going to do into an urban landscape. We've just been doing one with Hammerson's up at Brent Cross, where actually they're paying to put in a road junction, and we have actually negotiated that deal. And that road and junction will be built as part of the shopping precinct expansion. So I think it can be done, but one of the things that the public sector needs to do, and is really awful at, is being nice to people who are trying to do things close to their patch, because they immediately start applying all their standards and all the linkages they want to make and everything they can do to make planning consents difficult, they will. Because there's quite a difficult mindset about the public sector which needs to be shifted here. And I think as we go through, the Treasury is saying they can't afford big projects, we've done the 4 big H's, it's got to be small now. We need to really work hard at liberating this join between government and the private sector to get some of these projects, smaller projects to go, which the private sector I think will fund most of.
Excellent, thank you very much. I think there's just a question down the front row there.
James Kidner from Improbable. We're a tech startup who do massive scale simulations, so enable you to look at projects and their implications before they actually roll out. I'm interested in the sort of anthropology of this question, if you like. We live by stories, and a big story is an easier one for people to buy into and to see their role in it. But the public consultation process for all these things enables all the counter stories, and we lose the sort of the railway track in the nettles at the side of it. How can people keep that focus on the dividends of the main story rather than getting lost in all the distractions?
Excellent, thank you. Real good range of questions there, going right back to self-interested, consultation and keeping the focus. Who wants to start off picking up any of those?
Bridget's going to answer Tony's question because it's too complicated for me.
Bridget, you're away. You've been nominated.
Thanks, Isabel. Okay, rent-seeking behaviour. I've been accused of rent-seeking behaviour in working on various projects in my time, so I guess I should be able to answer this. And I think that there's 2 parts to it. Firstly, there's the challenge between, if you like, evidence-based policy and policy-based evidence. So quite a lot of projects, after all, emerge out of history, somebody's good idea, and there's sufficient instinctive, if you like, support for it, that then the work needs, the people are hired to make, if you like, the formal case, put the ribbon round it, tick all the boxes, calculate the costs and the benefits, and so on and so forth. But quite often the idea has come from somewhere else. Sometimes one isn't even very clear where. And the idea that people who are paid to make a case make the best case possible, is that, that's what they're paid to do, and that's actually what they should do. That's, good performance management rather than rent-seeking behaviour. But I agree that it can look perhaps, you're being paid to do something, so you should be doing it for free, really? You're being paid to do a piece of work, and that can seem inappropriate. But I think that just needs to be dealt with by, if you like, the anthropological part of this, and to go back to your question as to how the narrative is developed for and the stakeholders are integrated into the approach. So one of the things that actually consultants get paid for these days is to go out and do the sort of things that you were talking about, going to the community, talking to people, finding out how they want to, what the issue is, and how to get them more engaged. One of the words that we're trying to use in the National Infrastructure Commission, we're trying to ban the word consultation and replace it with, and now I've forgotten what the word is. Oh no!
Further suggestions from the audience.
Yeah, digital. But much more about engagement. Engagement, that's the word. So you involve engagement rather than consultation, because consultation has exactly got that. I've been paid to do this, I've come up with this brilliant idea, and you will like it, won't you? So I think that for me, how we deal with this is around that engagement process. Infrastructure Commission, we've done a huge engagement process around what the methodology should be looking for with this 30 years. We've done another call for evidence. We're hopefully going to produce a paper in June. God and the election willing. That was the original plan. And then there will be a further piece of engagement around that. So hopefully by the time we get to the assessment, there will have been sufficient kind of engagement with all the communities, whatever they may be, whether technical, industry, communities, local authorities, that there will be a certain amount of buy-in. There won't be complete agreement, but a certain amount of buy-in into what we're going to say. And in that process, obviously, people will have been employed to do particular pieces of work. But I think the answer has to be around how you've engaged people so that they don't feel that whatever work then comes out is something that's being done to them rather than with them.
Isabel, do you want
A comment on Simon's comment about Brent Cross and sort of bringing private, going back to the future, the way the underground was built was by private companies. And now we've sort of gotten ourselves into a position in the infrastructure industry where we're all just sitting there waiting for somebody in government, if only they would, get themselves organized and tell us what to do next. So absolutely, I agree with you. And I think just two thoughts on that. One is, places like Sydney and Los Angeles have put in place these unsolicited bid type of approaches, and they put somebody in place who's, this is the guy you go and talk to if you're interested. And whilst at one level it's a bit, sometimes it's just a bit of marketing, but it actually sends a message to the organization internally that we are the kind of organization that wants ideas from the private sector to come into the organization, and it is very important signaling. And I think that's a sort of, let's say, easy thing that an organization can do in the infrastructure sector on the public side to send that message to say we're interested. And another good example is Peter Hendy at Network Rail, who said, we have no money for Control Period 6. We want people in the property industry, landowners, to come forward with suggestions for how we can jointly invest in the railway. And because that's been a consistent message that's been put out from the senior leadership, it has made a difference in the property industry that I've sensed even in the last year. People are trying to think about how they can bring proposals forward. So I think senior leadership and sort of signaling like that can make a bit of a difference to get people in the organization to be nicer and more accommodating. And just on the improbable point, that's a complete, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's extraordinary that we're sent out to engage supposedly on projects in the political sphere and in senior leadership roles in infrastructure with material that is just, embarrassing, and not only that, but off-putting to people. Whereas, there's in the gaming industry, there are platforms that enable people to shape a world globally in real time. But it's as if none of that is happening. We have two-dimensional pieces of paper with squiggly spaghetti lines on them, and it's like, we think it's super interesting because we can talk about how big the curb should be or whatever. But the public don't understand that, and I think kind of bringing the way to maintain that narrative is to have interactive tools that people can actually say, you know, we used to endlessly have to go out and say, well, you know, this is the cycle lane we want to build, this is how we want to change the roundabout. And people say, well, why didn't you do this? Or couldn't we try that? 3 months, transport modeling, we'll be back. Right, you know, to try out one scenario. So that just cannot be the right answer.
I think the standards point, though, that you were also making, Simon, is very important, and it's a real struggle to deal with, because standards just, and I'd be interested in Ed's perspective on this, and you're a very safety conscious industry, they just ratchet up. And I mean, we had big attempt a few years back in Network Rail to say, you know, which are the standards which we absolutely must have and which are the ones that are kind of nice to have and so on. And I have to say that it just went into the sand in the kind of, oh, well, yes, but, you know, that, and the risk averseness in actually, you know, if you said if you were going to drop or what would be seen as relaxing a standard and then something happens, what would be the, you know, you'd lose your job. So there's a real, I don't have a good answer to the standard inflation challenge.
Excellent, thank you, Bridget. Ed, standards, but also quite interested in your take on telling stories out of NASA, an organisation that obviously did.
I think I'm going to jump out of my chair. I think, you know, we hit it on the, you know, we live by stories. I mean, that's the nature of humans. One of the things that NASA does really well is that they learn that, they know that. I mean, you can see that, you go to a movie, Hidden Figures, you go to The Arrival, you go to, and so you get help from Hollywood because people, they don't need a number that says why this is important. They see the potential, the possibility. The second thing related to that is, when I was at NASA, I would always just spend time with our young professionals, people who just joined the organization. They haven't been there long enough to have been brainwashed that this is normal, so they'll tell you the truth, and and if you ask them, why are you here? They would always come back to the importance of the goal, the vision, the purpose. They felt they had their dreams, and they wanted to be working on a project that was doing something special. And I think that we need to come back to what's the story to the public, why is this important? I went to a pharmaceutical organization, you know, and you think initially of money and all this kind of stuff. On their walls were, you know, these pictures of children, and you know, I talked to someone, what's this, and they would say, hey, we're doing things here to, you know, to make people healthy. They had their story, the connection in terms of that. But in project parlance, it's the goal, you know, it's the mission, it's the vision, it's what gets a sponsor to say this is important. Why did you do the London Olympics? Somebody had a vision and a dream, and it made a connection, and all those kinds of things. So I think that's the thing. But I see a lot of project folks, they don't. I mean, one of the questions I would ask all the time is, what's your number one goal? What's your reason for being a project? And then to go to other people on the team. And if I got someone, I was at an organization, I asked that question, and the deputy couldn't answer it. And so you got to spend the time getting that. And then the other thing to listen for, are the members of your team, do they see the top 2 or 3 goals along the same lines? Because we had failures where, you know, one part of the organization saw safety as most important, another saw, you know, innovation, adaptability as most important, and so you can go in different directions. But that dream, that story, that vision is really, I think, at the end, the key thing that drives everything.
Excellent, thank you. I'll take some more questions and comments, quite a few coming through. So I just want to start with the gentleman there. I'll come there in a second. Yeah, in front. I'll come to you behind in a moment, and then I'll come back round.
Thanks. John Corrible, Oxfordshire County Council. I think we've got one concept, the Oxford-Cambridge connectivity stuff, that has definitely got emergent flagship status with work streams within it. My question is, under that, there are a whole range of projects that would be small in your categorisation, you know, the 200 to 500 million around flood alleviation, A40 fixing, Cowley branch line, all that business. What is it in your experiences that cause a small to medium project to catch on or not catch on in terms of support from public and private sector funders, you know, deliverability, benefit, innovation, political support? What's the balance of stuff that a rent seeker, thank you Tony, should be trying to make sure that we've got, we even appointed a Canadian guy as our Director of Strategy and Infrastructure, but the pension fund has not followed him. It's quite disappointing.
Excellent. And if just take the gentleman behind, and then I'll come to Christopher.
Thank you. Robbie Owen from Pinsent Masons. A couple of points on communities and skills. First, communities. I was very taken by Isabel's point about smaller projects being, in effect, easier for communities to, in effect, raise issues about. Elephant and Castle Roundabout was the example you gave. And I suspect that, it is the case that bigger projects, communities find much harder to have their voice heard at the stage when it probably matters most, which is sort of detailed design and construction impact. And we're certainly finding this to be the case in relation to sort of research done by UCL in relation to UK national infrastructure schemes. So I think probably to answer the question on so far as impact on communities are concerned, and I think this is a growing issue actually in terms of UK infrastructure anyway, I think probably bigger is possibly not better. In terms of skills, I think, I don't know, but I suspect that the bigger projects do not give rise to economies of scale in terms of the number of people they need. I suspect it's the opposite, and they suck out a lot of skills. We're already hearing a lot, aren't we, about people panicking about HS2 and the other big projects taking a lot of skills out of the market. And I think that there's been a lot of emphasis recently on blue-collar skills from politicians, very worthy initiatives, tunnelling academies and the like for HS2 and for Crossrail. It seems to me that we're missing a trick here, and that I would have thought that the public and private sector needs to come together, and all the different sectors, energy, transport, water, waste, and actually come together and debate whether there's a merit in setting up some sort of national academy for infrastructure, because there are some programs available. I think the IPA run one for the public sector, but it is just the public sector, and I think it's a growing issue that I'd be interested in the panel's views on.
Excellent, thank you. And then Christopher, just over there.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to talk. I've been fascinated by what's been said.
Christopher, could you just introduce yourself?
Christopher Foster. I think we're in danger of overcomplicating the issues. If I think back to the various projects which I've been involved in, the first one was the Victoria Line, which I did the evaluation with the help of two members of the London Transport at the time. One woman who knew absolutely everything about the line and where everything was, and an economist who did a lot of very hard work. The risks were assessed, and it looked that the benefit-cost ratio was very, very positive indeed. And that's an important point when you decide what to do. You try and make sure that you've got something where the return is very high. And we went ahead and did it. Had rather more problem when the Treasury, having been persuaded in advance, was actually the very first project in this country the Treasury approved on a cost-benefit analysis. They said, that's fine, but we're going to charge a profit rate. We're going to charge. And then we had to show the Treasury that actually made the return negative. But simplicity and straightforwardness and using people who actually know the business is very, very important. If I go to a later project I was in charge of, was on the Channel Tunnel. And there one had a very difficult problem, really. The railways insisted on doing the costing of what would be supplied, and they underestimated the cost enormously. And indeed, we know, or think we know, and knew very soon, why they wanted to do that. They wanted that project come what may. And the answer to that, in my experience, and I give quite a number of examples, is to have a system which everything is written down and openly, all the figures that are relevant to the calculation are written down. Anybody can have a look at them unless there's some very secret reasons against it. And you have a discipline which means that all the relevant data, which is crucial, is published. And if overall approval is given by the Minister, Secretary of State in question, and he or she, in a sense, has to say what the cost-benefit return was, and whether it was sufficient. And if they bring in other tests, other arguments, which is the legal situation, they are able to say, okay, the benefit doesn't exceed the cost as far as travel, say, is concerned, then they have to say what it is, what the contribution benefits the community from carbon, or dealing with carbon, what that is.
Right. Chris,
and furthermore, if I can,
but quickly.
And furthermore, there should be a situation in which the minister not only has to put his name to this on the basis of published information, but thereafter there is a test every few years as to how far the predictions have been made, cost predictions and benefit prediction. But it is, I remember again when I was on the board of British Rail, having been involved in several strange situations beforehand. The HS1 was it was very, very arguable whether it should go ahead. In fact, it was virtually certain that the Secretary of State wanted it.
Yes.
He should have been asked to say that he wanted it, even though published information suggested it was no damn good.
Excellent. I think we're there. We're with you on that. Great. Thanks very much. Come back to the panel quickly. Quite a few people wanted to come in. So, but there's a lot of very good thoughts there. Quick responses and thoughts on some of the issues we've had. We come back again to some of the self-interest points and things like that. Do you want to?
Just quickly on the, Sir John's point around the sort of medium-scale projects, and it's sort of linked to Robbie's point about engagement. And I love your National Academy for Infrastructure idea. I don't know what it is, but it sounds awesome. Yeah, let's do it. I think part of the problem actually is there's too many people who have too many ideas in infrastructure about how to solve all these vexed problems. So we need to just, sort of like eliminate 90% of them, and then we will solve it here. But just on the medium scale project, I mean, not to belabor the point, but as we all know, but we sort of pretend it doesn't happen, the way projects typically happen is somebody had an idea, then we pretend that they're like 3 ideas so that we can have some options, then we kill off the 2 that we didn't really ever think were real anyway, come back to the first idea, then we do all the detailed design and the engineering and the technical stuff, and we do the kind of detailed case, which is all about just what does the green book say, make up a load of numbers to make sure that we tick all the boxes, get the benefit cost ratio to where it needs to be, and then we let's call those fluffy people who do engagement and give them some stuff and send them out to talk to the community, which is exactly the opposite way of the way you should do it. We all know that the right way to do it is like go out and find the people who are going to advocate for those projects. And Elephant and Castle is actually a project that I was involved with that was very successful in terms of just the community engagement, because we started with the what do you guys want, took the community along with us in a proper way, the way you should really do it, co-designed it with them, and then there was like nary a peep when we put it in place. By contrast, with Vauxhall Gyratory, we said, here's the answer, because it's so obvious, because Vauxhall's so terrible. So obviously everybody here is going to need an answer, and we came up with an idea and brought it forward. And people were so angry that we had assumed that we knew the answer, that project was delayed by 2.5 years ultimately. So I do think there is something very basic about almost, but more scientific mapping of who are the advocates and actually trying to get those people on side early on and shaping it with them. I know that sounds really banal, but it is very true and doesn't happen in 99% of cases.
Just very quickly, that's absolutely right. So whether it's a small project or a large project, you need to get all the stakeholders, as many stakeholders as you can get in one place, supporting you with their different perspectives, and that is the way you get projects really to happen, whatever scale they are. And I just want to challenge on the small versus large, because I think the National Academy of Infrastructure is a really good idea, but in order to attract people to it, you have to make infrastructure exciting, and I do think that's where the big projects come in. So you go around school, you're talking about STEM subjects and all of that. It's the large things that make people think, oh, right, maybe I'll take that seriously, maybe I'll get involved. So you may end up only working on a small flood alleviation scheme somewhere, but actually you come into it because you think there's something really big that you'll be able to do. Just one further point. I absolutely agree. Keeping it simple, keeping it transparent, and keeping it open is a good basis for analysis. And I have to say, we've created just as much ratchet and upping the ante in terms of all the analysis which you're supposed to do in the boxes that you have to tick in the analysis side as we have on the engineering standards side.
Excellent. Thank you. Ed?
Yes, I guess one of the things I got out of that is portfolio. And I think it's a mistake to look at bigger or smaller or anything like that. So the NASA experience is NASA will always try to have at least 2 flagship missions. A couple of reasons for that. One, if you can't sell a big flagship, then maybe what you're doing really isn't all that important to the public. And if you're only doing small, it's easier to, basically say goodbye to small. So that's a little bit maybe self-serving, but there's a truth to that. The other thing is there's a heritage issue. If you look at a mission like Shuttle, which actually goes over like 40 years when you look at the concept stage, closes down. There is so much heritage technology, management approaches, international relationships, that anything that comes after that will be feeding off of for years. That oftentimes the really big flagships, we don't measure it right because we don't look at the total life cycle, not only costs but benefits. And there's been a lot of missions where if you look at it in its own little area, you'd say, well, should we have done that or not? But then if you factor in all of the programs and projects and technologies that came out of it over the following 20 years, it's a totally different equation. And one of the things that NASA will worry about is you don't get often as much as the years go by in something smaller by definition. And the larger missions basically will leave that. So you got to look at the life cycle, and I think the answer is a portfolio, a strategic approach in terms of what is it we're trying to do, what's the really long-term, factor that we're looking at in terms of society, and where's that jumping off point. So again, I would say size doesn't matter. You have to have that portfolio approach and that balance, and it also then gives a talent, period where it's helpful for a career to start off with the small and then to get to the mid, and now you have people who can take on the really big challenges. So.
That's great. I just get a sense of number of questions. I think we'll go just Simon there. Come there. I'm conscious that side of the room I'm neglecting. And I will take quite a few in this little batch because otherwise we'll run out of time for everyone. Simon.
Simon Judge from the Finance Function. It's been a really interesting discussion about the sort of ecology and anthropology within a project. I wonder if the panel could say, is there a role for proper external assurance, or is it really just all for the birds?
Great, thank you. And gentleman just beside you, actually, I think.
Sorry, Martin Hurst, one-time government economist and major project SRO, now working at UCL, among other things. I've heard 2 things about the relationship between large projects and government institutions. One is that there's an institutional failure, because to use John Gummer's phrase, big projects are favoured because they're sexy. The other is that big projects are favoured because the institutional arrangements are always going to be complicated, and big projects are the only way to wade through them. So the question is, do we need institutional change, or is it just a given, in which case big projects will be favoured?
Okay, that's great, thank you. And then we'll go across to Jill on that side, and I'll come forward. I'm conscious I've got a few coming up there. So
Hi, I'm Jill Rutter. I'm a former Director of Strategy and Sustainable Development at DEFRA, which is the role in which I want to ask this question. I'm very worried that we're getting to a point here where basically you could characterise what the panel has been saying is we basically have lots of infrastructure projects that people want to do, and then we have to find a rationale for them, rather than what Bridget started off by saying is you actually have to go back and decide what's the problem you're going to solve. And surely the first question you need to be asking yourself is infrastructure the answer there, or are there actually better approaches to dealing with that than reaching for infrastructure with all the sort of problems it might have, which may mean demand management, thinking of lots of other things, because it seems to me that you're just going to lock us into solutions of more and more concrete for things, rather than actually thinking what can we do to address the problem. Then once you actually get a project, so take Crossrail. Crossrail is a very useful way of getting slightly faster from Paddington to Liverpool Street or whatever, as far as I can see it. You're connecting places in Berkshire that have virtually no housing attached to them to move them fast into London. So what's the point? So if you're going to do things like that, don't you need some policy coherence to say, if we're actually going to make that investment, how then do we sweat it so we actually get some value out of it?
Great, thanks, Jill. I'm going to overload the panel slightly, but come to just down here, and then come across now.
My name's Jordan Sims, actually from PMI, and one thing that I wanted to ask a question on based on quickly around the room, a lot of comments on public funding, private funding. We've talked about, the meeting the wall of money versus the resources or the projects themselves. And in our involvement around the globe, whether that's with shortlisting projects in Jakarta with World Economic Forum, anything along those lines, it's almost like the conversation runs, step one, we have to drive an investor enthusiasm, whether it's public sector or private sector. Step three, we need an ROI or an impact. Do you see a lot of conversation in the infrastructure side around the actual delivery? Or is that a lacking part of the conversation on how we meet that budget scope and schedule, so to speak, to drive that confidence for the investor enthusiasm and then also the ROI on the back end? And the second part of that question, kind of leaning towards Ed's expertise on the people side, how do you guard, what's the first layer of defense against that superlative project on the large scale side to guard against that optimism bias?
Okay, a lot of very good questions there. I've got another set that I'm going to come back to if we get, so hopefully a few responses. We've got a lot of the assurance questions, some of the institutional change. What Jill's sort of challenge on Bridget, have we missed your starting point in a subsequent conversation? Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think that can happen. I think Crossrail is actually not a good example of that, in fact. And indeed, the first question I asked when I arrived at the GLA in 2001-2 is, what is this for? Why are we doing this? And I actually started by saying, what's the question? And is this the answer? And became convinced that actually it wasn't the only answer by any means, but it was actually part of the answer, and it's certainly not about getting faster. It's in fact about the capacity of the overall London transport system, which is a rather different thing. Was rather difficult. That was easy to articulate actually in the context of what the story was. Much harder to articulate in the context of what the numbers were that you had to tick. And that's why it required an enormous amount of effort to get it over the line, which was that senior time. I mean, I've probably spent more of my personal time on the Crossrail project than any other thing in my entire career to get it into that point. And that's actually because I don't think big projects are favoured. Small projects are favoured because they feel much less risky, and because they feel like you can evaluate and appraise the benefits more easily within our existing systems. So that's why it requires much greater effort to create the flagship project and to keep the momentum behind it. And that's why you then get, I think, an overuse of senior time trying to keep those on the road. And that's why small projects can actually sometimes go even more badly wrong than the big projects do. The big projects just do it much more visibly than the small projects, and therefore tend to have somewhat bigger implications. I'm not going to answer to come back to the optimism bias if we have time later. I'm not going to answer it now, but the only thing I did want also to say is, yes, I agree about external assurance. We should do more of it. Right. And I think that would help, in fact, on some of these optimism bias questions, which otherwise just becomes a kind of complete just black box. Oh, you must add 40% or 50% or whatever it is. And external assurance would help you cut the project into the appropriate parts, which would mean that you could manage those risks and manage those costings more effectively.
Thank you, Bridget. Isabel.
Yeah, just really quickly on Jill's point, I mean, we're here to talk about infrastructure. The transport industry is, abysmal at using its existing assets, using policy interventions, et cetera, to do that. I sort of gave up arguing against Tideway, dare I say it, because, we hadn't really explored what the alternatives were, but, that's another evening where we will bore on about that. External assurance, I think, yes, but maybe earlier in the process, I think it's sort of like, here we are at stage one, what are the things that you need to do? Oh, look, you haven't actually spoken to anybody about this, or, that doesn't happen. Why doesn't that happen? Like at an earlier stage gate. I think the bigger point I wanted to make was around the kind of, the volume of projects, your point, I mean, I don't agree with John's point around, they're sexy. I mean, maybe some people feel that way, that's fine. I just think the difficulty is the volume of projects that a cohort of individuals that are needed to drive these things, whether that's at the London level, the national level, it's the same everywhere. It always goes back to the same people, because it's at the senior leadership where these decisions can be taken. And for whatever reason at the moment, at least in transport infrastructure, we can only handle a very small number of those at once. It doesn't matter whether they're big or medium size, let's say. Anything that's sort of from a certain size up needs those people to be involved. So the intervention that's probably needed is finding a way to need less of those people's time by getting the system to work better, so that there isn't the need for these very senior people to be heavily involved in negotiating the Northern Line extension or whatever it is. So how do we kind of design some systems to do that? And is that about engaging the public earlier and stakeholders earlier? Is it about building up a cohort of individuals through Robbie's National Academy who can actually turn the handle on these projects? Because it's your point about it's the business model that I think is quite difficult. There's not a lot of people people can do the economic case till the cows come home and the amazing analysis. But what is the actual cash flow, by year? Where are the risks? Who holds them? What's the basis for that cash flow analysis? That's the skill set that's missing in the industry at the moment. Private sector won't put their effort into it because it takes 3 to 6 months to even understand it and write it down, and then you might not get the project, so why would you ever do that? And public sector usually doesn't understand those kinds of questions the way that it needs to, and to put together a business model in a spreadsheet in language that a banker would understand. That is the gap at the moment as I see it.
That's great. Thank you very much. Ed?
I mean, so first of all, I'll say I agree strongly with, what the panel has already talked about, right? So we'll start there, which is a lot really complex questions, which is kind of big even from a NASA standpoint. So I got 60 people in a room here, and one of the issues of what's of value, what's of greatest value, we're all going to disagree. I mean, even within NASA, you got a couple hundred project managers, they'll disagree with what's valued. I would always come back to the competency issue. At the end of the day, I can't predict the future. I can't say what is the public going to vote for. You can't figure that out in a democracy or leadership. But what you can guarantee, what you can go towards is, as an individual, as a project team, as a program, as an organization, that there is a respect for the capability, the confidence, the sense that there's professionalism here. And from a NASA standpoint, I can go to different places in the world. I can go to different places in the United States, and people would often thank me for being at NASA. And when I asked them in probe it, they didn't often have a sense of necessarily the value, and some people would agree, some people would disagree, but I would often get the sense of, we believe that your folks try to do it right, that there's a professionalism, there's a certification in terms of it, there's a competency framework, there's a transparency. When we mess up, we've supplied the world with some of the best case studies of how to do it wrong. And I think that, so again, I think it comes back to are we developing competency in terms of the government, in terms of the people, in terms of the organizations. So whatever the value decision is in terms of where to go, there's the sense that we can believe in you. And if that answer is we don't, then it leads to, well, you know where it leads to. So I think competency.
Thank you. Excellent. Quick final round of questions. Just start at the front here. Okay. Keep the...
Thank you. I'll be brief. Yes, Peter Unwin from the Whitehall and Industry Group, WIG. And just to say, I'd be very happy to have a separate evening with Isabel on Tideway, having been responsible for that at DEFRA in a previous existence. But my question for now, I find myself thinking, is there a link here to the current devolution agenda? Because some big projects, whether it's the Olympics or HS2, have to be national projects by their very sort of definition and shape. But other big national policies, such as building, housing, improving flood protection, are things that happen nationally in places all over the country. And the more that has devolved, thinking of the problems you've brought up, such as bandwidth of people to deal with them, engagement with local communities, Jill's question about asking the question, is infrastructure the right solution here or rather the better? Those are all things that in some way can be dealt with better at a local level than a national level. And maybe we have too many big national projects that could be smaller local projects.
That's great, thank you. Just there.
Yep. Hartley Miller. I'll admit to being a member of the governance SIG of APM. And it's about governance, which I think has not really been focused on, although it's very obviously, in the case of the flagship projects, that there is an issue as to whether or not the political will to continue on the part of all those who are part of the co-ownership is adequate at the beginning, fully thought through, but also is periodically checked. The people are still on board. We've got gateway reviews which look very much at the technology. Should we also have business case reviews that look at the teaming and the governance?
Excellent. Gentleman two behind, just that way. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you, David Archer from Societe. I'll keep this very brief into two catchphrases, really. I very much agree with the thrust of the argument that says it's important to engage with the users and the people who will benefit from the infrastructure. And the watchwords that have always worked for me there are what's the problem and why does it matter to those people? And then the point that many have made about the bridge between the technical solution and the people who've got to be convinced of it is not a new one. I'm old enough to have been a graduate engineer at the Central Electricity Generating Board, and on our first training course, the thing that has always stayed with me was the lesson that said above the screen, being right doesn't count. Because unless you can take people with you, you ain't got a project.
Thank you very much. The gentleman on the aisle there.
Hugh Lloyd, head of the infrastructure team at IPPR. Going right back to Bridget's observations at the start about what's it for and the purpose question, it seems to me that part of the challenge is having an open enough mind about how the purpose will be met to then trigger what might happen. And one of the things we don't do very well is surface the assumptions that people have about what the answers look like. Given digital has the capacity to change the world in ways that none of us can imagine, and all of us are using devices that our grandparents would think of as magic, a mobile phone, an iPad, etc. What do you think the biggest white elephant infrastructure projects currently in the pipeline are?
Right. Bridget can answer that under PERDA rules. And gentleman in the blue there.
It's a sort of simplistic version of the last question is, what are your favourite projects that shouldn't have happened, either big or small?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Apologies to anyone who I've missed out, but I think we'll now go back to the panel. Your thoughts on those questions, you pick out sort of key bits, and certainly we're interested in your biggest failures as well as biggest successes out there. But any concluding things that you think the one takeaway that you want people to walk out of the room with tonight would be?
Okay, well, we've been traditionally so slow at doing pieces of infrastructure. There aren't very many white elephants out there. Various people have different views, but I'm actually not going to, at the moment, I don't really want to talk about specific projects in that way. Sorry, guys. Ask me in June, and I'll come back to it. So two things that I would like to comment on. One is devolution. I actually think we could have done the whole thinking about HS2 and saved a lot of time and effort if we'd actually started with regional and city engagement and asking people what they wanted out of it and where the stations ought to be, incidentally, and whether one should be privileging 400 kilometres an hour. Again, things that I've said elsewhere before. We could have actually done, so subsequently we've had some of those conversations and we've rejigged part of it, Sheffield being an obvious example, which was a recommendation that we made from the NIC. So getting that devolution right and having the right balance and asking people what they want something for comes back to the discussions that we were having earlier, and devolution should make that possible. So I don't see the distinction that you want to draw between the national one, which is going to be pushed on everybody, and the regional one. That comes back to that engagement. And I also therefore agree on the governance point and getting the continuing engagement. And one of the things that things go wrong, and you get the scope problem happening, which happens, it's not just a public sector problem, it happens in many projects, is actually, again, what are you doing this for? Why are you making this scope change? Do you need to make the scope change? Is there a budget for that? And if you don't want to spend that budget, then okay, you can't have the scope. And getting that sponsorship and delivery piece clearer is the crucial element in successful project delivery wherever you are and in whatever organisation. And that does get blurred in both private and public, but in public it tends to get blurred faster and more.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Ed?
Yeah, I guess so. We've been talking a lot about engagement, and I go to bookstores and engagement is out there. To me, at the core, I think people are engaged where they're included. And so, I think to me the key driver is, are we having conversations with people? I spoke to someone who's leading a project at NASA. It was an institutional project. And we tended to do institutional projects different than aerospace. Specifically, we sometimes did institutional projects without project management, right? And because it's not our DNA, it's not something that's going to fly or anything like that. And when I was talking to the person, I was pulled in because they're having problems, and I found out why. They weren't going to, in this case, the NASA users, which were the engineers and the project people. And I said, you're doing this thing that impacts them in terms of their life. How come you haven't spoken to me? And the person said, I don't want to speak to them until it's done, because they're just hard, they're going to disagree with this, they don't want it to happen. I said, well, you're going to deliver something. Well, they'll see the benefit of it then. And I said, you don't know. I said, you can develop the greatest thing, and NASA people on principle will kill you for not having included them. But again, there's that kind of, we're often, I think, afraid of conversations. We're afraid of talking to humans, to people, because they may tell us things we don't want to hear. But I think we got to have that comfort level early on. And the digital thing, I think, is a total game changer, because people are going to have the conversations whether you're there in the room or not.
Excellent.
And
that's brilliant. Isabel, last words to you.
I think the point around devolution, it potentially is, I think there's a skills gap issue in this sort of transition period where, how can we attract the right quality people into the devolved authorities is a challenge in the sort of medium term. But the more the devolved authorities can understand their convening power, the potential is that you can, by 10 times, increase the number of senior people who can get these projects to happen on the convening power basis. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity in that respect and connecting to politics. Agreed on the digital point. We use social media. We started to use social media a little bit at the end of my term at City Hall to mobilize support, also behind the scenes, for things that we wanted to do and get that buy-in. And the whole infrastructure industry hasn't got their heads around it at all. Municipal government hasn't got their heads around it. It's seen as like a bad, scary thing that young people do, which is also true. But the more we can kind of tap into it and understand it, I think will be absolutely transformational, not least from the narrative perspective and how we engage people. It opens up massive opportunities. Really, as far as I'm concerned, all infrastructure projects are kind of bad projects. Because I just, at least in my industry, nobody ever looks at the operational opportunities within the network. And, that's all totally tedious, partly because people think that politicians aren't interested in it, which is not, and, meanwhile, millions of people in the southeastern, service area in London are suffering at the moment. And any politician who could come to terms with that and get to grips with it would be, adored forever. So I think there's just a general problem in the industry about that. And while I have the stage, I just wanted to say what an illustrious audience, and it is so great to be able to talk to these guys. So thank you for that.
Well, that's very good of you. Let me say, first off, I think we've set a lot of questions for the joint project with the PMI to tackle. The answers will be coming out in a few months' time, so look for that. I'd like to join Isabel in thanking you for such great participation, and the conversation is not over, because as ever an evening at the Institute there will be wine and refreshments outside, so please stay and continue the conversation. But also, if people would like to join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful contribution. Thank you very much.